coordinated, and the interviewer would be Pritha Kejriwal. And thanks to Kolkata Literary Meet, and thanks to especially to Ms. Malavika Banerjee, one of our members, who has made this possible for us to have this program today, as the one that we had on the 26th January with Shabana Azmi and Javed Akhtar and Jaswinder Singh. And Pritha, I would like you to come over and start the proceedings. And I would like to request Mark, Yen, and Adrian also please join us on the stage. Pritha, you have to decide on the seating arrangements. Okay. For them. Now I would like to request our President Kunal Raychaudhuri to please felicitate the 4 persons sitting on the dais. First, Mr. Mark Tully. Something to take back with you, Mark. Ms. Pritha Kejriwal. Mr. Ian Jack. Sorry. And we have reserved the special one for the last, but not the least, Mr. Adrian Levy. All 3 of them, I'm sorry, have had some experience at the time when we had this problem in Mumbai on 26/11, and Pritha is going to take them through that route and their experiences to share with our crowd today. Okay, Pritha, it's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I think the sheer immensity and complexity of the Indian subcontinent is sometimes so unforgiving and unfathomable, even for people who've spent entire lifetimes here. And very often, for somebody who's come from the outside, especially from the West, the experience is like being planted suddenly into a violent alien planet being lashed by neurosis, confusion, and chaos. But the 3 gentlemen who I have here with me have survived all that, and all that very well, to tell the tales of an ancient land with mind-boggling mirages so well. So none of them need any introduction. Sir Mark, Tully, Sir Ian, Jack, and Adrian Levy, they've spent enough time in the subcontinent and have told us extremely, extremely fascinating stories. And let me just start with you, Sir Tully, and to use your metaphor, that you've spent enough time on this great Indian ship being tossed about in angry seas again and again and again. Didn't you feel seasick? Didn't you want to desert the ship ever?
No, I never wanted to desert the ship. I've had a wonderful time here and have been treated with great kindness. I think one of the good things about covering India, it's also a good thing about living or spending time in this country, is that there is always something new happening. There is always a story here. And there are good stories and there are bad stories. But this is a land, I think, of eternal fascination, if I could put it like that. So I never felt seasick, and I hope that the stories I've told have helped people understand this country a bit.
So Jack, how did you get it under the skin? You've entered some of the secret realms of the subcontinent, which are somewhere only allowed to insiders. And how did you manage to do that? You have your pulse, hand on the throbbing heart of the subcontinent in many ways that most of us don't have.
Well, I think that's probably not true. I think you've all got a better hand than I have for the pulse of the subcontinent, really. I think actually to be a reporter in India, a foreign reporter in India, is a terrific privilege, because it's really unusual abroad, I think, as a journalist, to be met with such interest and friendship, really. And I agree with Mark. I think if you're at all a curious person, meaning if you have a sense of curiosity rather than being odd, it's a great place to be, because you can never stop asking questions. And I like doing that. And every time I come here, I've been coming here now since 1976, there are kind of new questions to ask and new things to write about. So although I felt sick in India, I've never felt seasick in India, and I've never felt sick in the Calcutta Club. So it's been a really, really wonderful time for me, really. It's changed my entire life. I mean, the direction of my life changed in 1976 to include India, and many things that have happened here made me into a slightly different person. So I'm really grateful and glad that I came.
Adrian.
Yeah, I've had similar and different experiences. I've never looked for disaster. When I looked at the heading for this talk, I was really worried by the idea that any of us were courting, seeking, relishing disaster of any kind, and it's not my association with the subcontinent in any way. It's actually much similar to what Mark and Ian has said. I think it's about storytelling. A remarkable privilege to access so many tiers of society with unfolding stories. I mean, I could be here for 1,000 years and still have a book full of ideas. I've got another 20 books I'd like to write if anyone would give me money to write them, and 20 films to make if I can find a broadcaster to show them. And that really is what attracts all of us to be here, is trying to understand some of the complexity, finding the right guides to that complexity, permanently being bamboozled, of course, trying to decode some of what you're told. And can I just say one other thing? I think there's a privilege sometimes from being an outsider here, which means that you can have a confessional relationship quite often with members of the authorities, in that you get treated quite differently, in that you are not subscribing to one side or another, and that perceived neutrality leads to these intimate relationships, which sometimes are very rewarding. Can I just give one anecdote? When I was researching a book called The Meadow before this book on Kashmir, and I ended up having this cat and mouse game with somebody who was still serving in IB, and I was wooing him with great ardor, trying to get him to tell me one particular story from 20 years ago, and he was having none of it. But I pursued and he rejected, and it was this mismatched relationship. And yet we ended up in Gandrabal, in this really elegant spot by the river, and he ended up throwing a rug down, and we shared omelettes together and had a picnic beside the river like lovers. And a fantastic story came out of there, and I think it was partly drawn out by this perception of me being an outsider but an insider. So perhaps something that we could all touch on is this outsiderly insiderliness that maybe we're trying to develop.
Yeah. Could I'd just like to tell a story which is slightly different to that, but also illustrates this strange phenomenon of the relationship you have. You know, very often one is involved in a hostile relationship with an official, because, like, for instance, when I used to go to Pakistan, I was extremely unpopular with General Zia, and he hated the BBC. And he had a spokesman called Colonel Salik. And Salik and I had this extraordinary relationship. Salik was meant to be totally hostile to me. But somehow or other, there was this friendship. On one occasion, I went to see Salik at lunchtime, just before lunch. And when we'd finished our conversation, he said to me, "You can't go yet." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Got to have a samosa." I said, "Look, I don't want a samosa. I'm going to have a good lunch somewhere else." He wouldn't let me go. He wouldn't let me go. And then eventually he said, "You can go." And then I said to him, "Well, why can't I go?" And he said, "Well, my office is above General Zia's office. When you walk out of this office, as you know, in the next floor, you go along a corridor, And it's the time of namaz, and General Zia comes out of his office at this time, and he says his prayers in the corridor. And I'm afraid, knowing your view of General Zia, that you might kick him up the arse. So that is an example, I think, of the sort of extraordinary relationship one has. When I was about to be thrown out during the emergency, I still had a wonderful relationship with Jamal Kidwai, who was the Secretary of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And when I came back again, one of the first people to welcome me was Jamal Kidwai.
I also think you can have a confessional relationship with perfectly ordinary members of the public. If you travel a lot by train in India, this used to be the case anyway, if you have a coupe, say, and you're with another gentleman, the chances are that at some point in the journey he'll say something like, "Do you love your wife?" And which gives him a chance to talk about why he doesn't love his own, really. And the thing is, the intimacy of questioning that comes from that kind of conversation, such as, how many children do you have? I'm afraid none, sir. Why not? There's no kind of reply to that question, really.
It doesn't seem to be.
We were just having a discussion just before we started, and Adrian said that we collectively disown and reject the title of, disaster reporting. And, talking about crisis reportage, I just want to start with this, just want to quote Arundhati Roy on this when she spoke about this in her essay called Peace is War. And she said that crisis reportage in the 21st century has evolved into an independent discipline, almost a science. The money, the technology, and the orchestrated mass hysteria that goes into crisis reporting have a curious effect. It isolates the crisis, unmoors it from the particularities of the history, the geography, and the culture that produced it. Eventually, it floats free like a hot air balloon, carrying its cargo of international gadflies, specialists, analysts, foreign correspondents, and crisis photographers with the enormous telephoto lenses. Somewhere mid-journey, and without prior notice, the gadflies auto-eject and parachute down to the site of the next crisis, leaving the crestfallen, abandoned balloon drifting aimlessly in the sky, pathetically masquerading as a current event, hoping it will at least make history. There are few things sadder than a consumed, spent crisis. So this whole idea of, this whole hunger for the spectacle, and you just put on your flashlights when the spectacle is on, as soon as it's over, the media vanishes and the entire place is left as dark, perhaps darker than it was before.
Yeah, I totally reject that kind of reporting for myself. I mean, I really like the idea of the Rykard Kapuscinski approach, a Polish journalist who was working at a time of communism and had no funds to go anywhere, and wrote a remarkable series of books. He was like the Zelig of journalism. Whenever an empire was crashing to the ground, he'd turn up and have the best interview, and yet they had no funds, and CNN would arrive by Learjet and he'd be on the bus. And his ethos was to be last to the story and last to leave. And ever since I've read his books, I've loved the idea of being last. And I actually think that the idea that you wait for dust to settle to tame chaos, if you truly want to understand some of the characteristics of a crisis, and that you stay the longest by having commitment to the people who are there, who are not simply, victims of a situation, but they become then relationships that you develop, and they're people who you live with for years afterwards. That's a much more profitable approach. Last to the story, last to leave.
I'd like to add something. I agree exactly with what Adrian says. And 10 years after the Bhopal gas disaster, I was asked to make a film 10 years after, and I thought, for the very reasons Adrian says, that this was a great idea. And I saw a documentary which had been made about 6 months immediately afterwards. And one of the little things which struck me was that no victim was named in that documentary. And I thought this was appalling. And it made me think that whatever I do in my documentary, I must make sure that the individuality, the personality, the names, of course, of the victims come out, because I think that's tremendously important. And again, similar example, after one of the Bangladesh floods, I wrote a piece called From Our Own Correspondent, which is a regular strand in BBC. And I wrote the whole piece about how when we do our disaster coverage, all too often we forget that it is the courage of the victims which really allows life to continue at all. If in a Bangladesh flood disaster, Bangladeshis had not been able to sit in frail rafters in the roof of their little huts for a week or more sometimes before relief came to them, well, they would die and the disaster would be infinitely worse. And there is a tendency, I think, for parachute journalists who come into disasters to just tell the very immediate and most sensational aspects of the story and then disappear. And I think if you look at television coverage of disasters, you do often at the end of it say to yourself almost, well, I can't really remember what that disaster I was seeing is, because the coverage looks so much like the previous disaster and the one before that and the one before that. And there is the sensationalism of the suffering, of the extent of the disaster, drowns out all the details, all the why it happened, the humanity, how people are surviving, and all the rest of it.
Ian, you wanted to say something.
I mean, I think it's difficult, this, because news is news. Things happen, they have to be reported quite quickly and briefly, and I have to say perhaps even entertainingly, in the sense that drama is always very useful to news. I mean, I always found when I was abroad that, especially in India, because news is anomalous, it's what usually doesn't happens. You construct a very odd picture of where you're reporting from. It would be very difficult, for instance, if I was a reporter now today, writing a story about coming to the Calcutta Club, that would not get into the newspaper, and probably quite rightly, unless it was really beautifully written. So news is about the things that don't usually happen. And I think if you want, when I was writing about India, I always felt there should be, along with my story, there should be a kind of what we used to call a fact panel, saying how many people lived in India, what its chief economic products were, how many castes there were in West Bengal, whatever. Because actually somebody reading my stuff in, say, Edinburgh or Stoke-on-Trent or Newcastle would have a very limited knowledge of where I was reporting from. So I think it's really I think if you want to find out what places are like, I think news is not the place to look. I think novels are the place to look. I mean, V.S. Naipaul, kind of non-fiction might be the place to look. I think that news cannot do that job, really. And I think and Kapuscinski, which Adrian mentioned, the Polish writer, his books are remembered, but they were written long after the events he was reporting on. And actually, it also has to be said about Kapuscinski, who's a bit of a hero in the Western world, is that his books should not be relied on because they often contain fiction. And I think Kapuscinski, who's suffered a decline in his reputation, having once been so high, is a good illustration of invention. He would argue to demonstrate the greater truth, but I've always been a bit suspicious of this phrase, the greater truth.
Ian, what you just said, it kind of raises a very fundamental question about the role of media in a society. If it has at all any role to truly, really educate them. Because all the content which usually addresses your instinct will get urgent attention than what addresses your intellect. But you're saying that news is not the place to look for it. So.
Well, there are different. I mean, news is a funny word, really. I mean, if we talk about the media more generally, then the media obviously plays a huge role in everything. It's the way we know about ourselves, partly, is the media. So that's a different concept, I think. And I think, I mean, I wouldn't be the first person to say this, and it's not a very original thing to say, but I think the media has replaced sort of religion as a source of authority, really, in our society. And I think we tend to believe it in the way that some people believed or still believe, of course, like Mark, in religion. That's not a sideswipe at you, Mark.
I think you
I've
can.
actually talked in this club about religion before now. So.
I think you can try and tame the chaos. You can be in the media and try and tame chaos and try and find meaning. I mean, one of the things that I find most satisfying is coming into a situation which may appear to be chaotic and reconstructing it from the inside out, and having the time to do that, which news doesn't allow you, but let's say reportage and books do. I mean, increasingly I've found, any kind of the longer form is what lends itself to that ability. As you're saying, news is a capsule, and really all it can do is capture that brief moment. But the reconstruction is what really matters, and trying to work out how you find facts, what facts you stick to the exoskeleton, who you can trust to be the bearer of those facts. Increasingly, that wouldn't necessarily be government agencies. I mean, when I came to look at Mumbai, there were 6 different timelines, depending on which agency you talk to, and each one suited the interests of the agency. So I think beginning at scratch with something empirical, like what time did things happen, actually becomes a great challenge. Constructing timelines, matching them to stories, extracting from that a real sense of who people are, rather than